everyone here so much. I think this is such a great idea. This is actually the first forum of its kind we've had in the entire presidential race. And I think it has taken way too long to get this going. And I want to thank you. I want to thank Rob over there, who's a timekeeper, so I'm trying to suck up to him. The state legislature, oh, seriously, he's got a big sign. Swati, one of my great supporters, and Molly, thank you so much. And I just want to say how important this is to me. Something you may not know about me, I got involved in politics in part because my daughter was born and she couldn't swallow. And they actually thought she wasn't going to survive. She was in intensive care. Everything she swallowed came out her nose. And it went on, and she had a feeding tube for 1.5 years. And gradually she got over it. But the story is good in that way, but it's good in an even bigger way. While she didn't even end up having a disability that was permanent, I learned so much. I learned the gift of watching these other families with kids in intensive care, and I got to know them, and I got to know the gift of love every day that they gave to their children. And then I got to know a lot of the people through PACER, which is a group of parents with kids with disabilities. I was on the board, the advisory board of that because of this, and it really changed my life and my approach to public policy, both as a county attorney where I worked with the disability community, but then also when I got to the U.S. Senate. And we can talk a little bit about that when I sit down, some of the work that I think needs to be done as we move forward. But I stand here in the tradition of Hubert Humphrey, right? And Tom Harkin and Paul Wellstone. We have our green bus out there you should check out. Paul Wellstone colors, Tom Harkin colors. But it was Hubert Humphrey that said this in his very famous speech in the 1948 Democratic Convention, which no one forgets, and you can look it up online. He said this: "The moral test of a government is how it treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the disabled." He was ahead of our time, and now we need to be ahead of our time and get these things done. Thank you.
Welcome, and thank you very much. People with disabilities who are working earn less than 2/3 of the median wages earned by people without disabilities with similar education levels. Have you given consideration to how many businesses could be incentivized to employ disabled individuals by paying adequate wages? And what do you see as the most significant issues surrounding that?
Well, I think the first thing, which is really clear, which would help in Iowa and across the country, is increasing the federal minimum wage and making sure that we treat people alike and that we increase the minimum wage. That is number one. Number two is just our entire education system so that we can make sure that people are prepared to get the best job that they can do. And so my first stop there is to get rid of Betsy DeVos. I think that would be a very nice thing. But when it comes to our jobs, I will say from my tours, I visit all 87 counties in my state every year. Now I am visiting all 99 counties in Iowa. And when I go to businesses on tours, especially manufacturing places, people are so proud. It is the coolest thing when they have a worker with disabilities. It changes a workplace in such a good way. And I will have factory people say, "Hey, this guy can't come over to see you, but I want you to go over to see him." Or, "She's over here and she does this part of the line, so could you come and meet her?" For me, it has been the most inspiring part of these job visits, because it's not just about the fact that people are employed that have disabilities. It's how it changes the entire culture of a workplace, and then we needed to change the entire culture of our country. But that must come from the top, from the president, and that's what I want to do.
Thank you. On mental health, Iowa is known for its quality of mental health care. The Department of Justice has found, and many state governments have acknowledged, that significant numbers of people with psychiatric disabilities have hospital admissions that could be avoided or shortened if sufficient community-based services were available. What would your administration do to expand the delivery of inpatient mental health care?
I was actually the candidate in this race that led with the mental health care plan. And that's because I think this has been the long overlooked issue and something that really no presidential candidate has taken on. Yet we know 1 in 5 people in this country have a mental health issue sometime in their lives. And we have the disability issues with mental health, but we also have people with other disabilities that may suffer from mental health problems. And so what's happened here with Iowa is, you're right, it's had a long tradition of leading this area. But right now, because of cuts from the Republican governor and changes, you actually are down to only 64 mental health public beds in the entire state of Iowa. It's the lowest percentage in the nation. And that has to change. And so what I have proposed is an increase in funding at every level. First of all, lifting this waiver cap that we have in place for beds, and the mental health community could tell you about why this is important in a state like yours, but it's something that would be really, really helpful for 16 beds or more. Also, funding for what you are talking about here, early intervention and having counselors, especially in areas that are more rural, so we don't have mental health deserts, basically, where people can't get any help. And how I have proposed funding for it, I think it's very important, especially when I'm facing down Donald Trump. I'm so looking forward to this. To be able to actually show how you're going to pay for things, because he has made a mess with the debt and hasn't put the money where he should, and then of course goes down and tells his friends in Mar-a-Lago after he signs that tax bill that you just got a lot richer. That's what he did, and that's going to be a big deal in this campaign. So what I would do is take the funding that we're going to see coming in a big way from those opioid lawsuits, billions and billions of dollars, and you're just seeing a fraction of it right now, and make sure that, yes, that money goes to treatment, but it also goes to mental health. And Congress can do that because there will be a master federal settlement of these cases. I would also put a 2 cents per milligram tax on opioids and use that money to fund mental health treatment. I would close a hedge fund loophole, which brings in billions and billions of dollars, and I've detailed how I'm going to pay for all of this. Because I think it is very important, few things. One, that we have treatment in the schools. It's especially hard for kids, and that they have access to help. And bullying, and you know what's going on, that's so difficult for kids with disabilities. 2, that we have help for adults in the communities. 3, that we have those mental health beds. And then 4, people with disabilities are employable, including with mental health disabilities. And if they do have jobs, by the way, we should have mental health parity with insurance. That's something that my mentor, Paul Wellstone, led, and that was a bill we finally passed, but we were having difficulties getting it implemented, and that's something I could do as president. And then the other piece of this is just making sure that there's no stigma, which is this is what a lot of this is about, so that people can go out and work in the workforce. Thank you.
When the IDEA was passed in 1975, Congress pledged to finance 40% of differential cost of serving students with disabilities. The closest the federal government has come to meeting that pledge is 19% in 2010. Higher levels of funding will ensure more students with disabilities receive the supports they need in K through 12. And will be able to complete high school and have the opportunity to go on to post-secondary education and post-secondary employment. Children with disabilities, especially those who are also people of color, often have unequal access to education resources despite the law guaranteeing such access. What would your administration do differently?
Okay. Well, first of all, I already mentioned one thing, and that is getting rid of Betsy DeVos, but also getting rid of a lot of those policies that she put in place, where she reversed a lot of the progress we've made for people with disabilities. The second thing is getting IDEA funded, and I put together an education proposal that includes this. And one of the ways we can get funding in for our education system is you look at that estate tax, you know how much people pay. If you literally just go down to the Obama levels, right, for the exemption from it, right now Trump put it at $11 million in their Republican tax bill. Think about that, $11 million. If you go down to where it was with $3.5 million, you would literally save over $100 billion that can be put and plowed right back into education. So there are ways, and you may not see everyone talking about how they're going to pay for everything, but it's really, really important to me because I think it's going to be one of those things in the general election where we're able to show what Hubert Humphrey talked about with the moral test of government, right? A moral test of government is what your budget is and where you put your money is and how you pay for things. So that's going to be really critical for me so that when we bring this out beyond the primary and we're in a general election and we're bringing in independents and even some moderate Republicans with especially in the disability community, I found stood up with us when we said don't repeal the Affordable Care Act. I'm not talking about representatives in Washington. They did not. I am talking about people out there in the Midwest especially. And so we're going to have to be reaching out to them. And I think one of the ways is to be honest about how we're going to pay for things. And this is how I would pay for the funding for IDEA.
Thank you. At this time, I would like to depart for a moment and to ask Gretchen Reck-Brown to come up. She is a deaf advocate and she works really hard throughout the state. She's got a question specifically, and voicing for her will be Joan.
Hello, Senator, thank you. I really wanted to ask you a question because many people don't know the deaf community they're really in a crisis. With our children, the children are in a crisis. Over 80% of the children are born to hearing parents. 90% of them are born, those parents have never met a deaf person. Those are hearing parents. Those hearing parents don't know what to do. I know, you felt the same when your daughter was born. I'm sure you had that experience. One of the biggest problems in our community that really we've all experienced is language deprivation. Our children are not being given access to language. I just recognized how difficult it is for someone to pay attention to language if they don't really have access to it. I have a good friend of mine who's living with me right now. Her first language is Spanish. I don't speak Spanish. So I'm trying to lip read her, and I can't understand a word. That realization, it's the same as deaf children who are born and given only spoken English without sign at all. So my question, really, here's the question. It's also actually Vanya's question. She's also a strong advocate for deaf children. What can we do at the federal level to enforce the language deprivation is eliminated? Because it impacts mental health, it impacts education, it impacts employment. What can we do?
Thank you so much. That's an incredible question. I think everyone should be able to communicate and express themselves and be part of our democracy and be part of our economy. So learning is a major piece of that. And so I look forward to working with you on this really, really important issue. I personally have not just talked the talk. My head of my office, technology, for over a decade now, is deaf in my U.S. Senate office. And he is just an incredible worker and great guy who's in our office. And so I've been able to see firsthand, in a not a huge office, about 25 people that we have there in D.C., just sometimes how you have to make sure that you do everything to include him, and with other new employees when they come in, so that they make sure that he's not left out of communicating and talking to people. And we've had this happen over and over again, and he's just such a valued member of our staff. And I know the same thing happens at the education level on up. So I look forward to working with you and would obviously make this a priority to make sure that everyone can communicate regardless of their disability. It's part of the reason to get to another disability of ALS that I was the Democratic lead on the Steve Gleason speech-assisted device bill. When Medicare was cutting funding, people would use these devices. In their case, with another disability, it was their only way that they could communicate And this is the crazy part. So they'd be out at home and they'd learn this, and it was a big part of their interactions with their families, just like sign language is for you. And then they would get on Medicare. They'd reach a point in their disease where they had to go into, say, assisted living or something like that. And then it didn't pay for it anymore. Crazy government rules. And so we actually introduced a bill to get it covered, and we got it done, and it's now covered. And so that idea of communicating, as someone who likes to talk a lot, is really key to me. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. Americans with disabilities face many obstacles and barriers to voting, including inaccessible polling places and voting equipment, difficulty getting to polling place, and poorly informed election officials and poll workers about access issues. But if campaigns were addressing the disability community like any other minority group, they might be more compelled to vote and could swing in an election. Do you support providing funding to states so that they can purchase new accessible voting machines to replace the first generation accessible voting machines that have outlived their useful life? And what are your proposals for enforcing the availability at polling stations?
Oh, I love this question. I'm actually the Democratic lead on the Senate Rules Committee, which is going to get really interesting in the next few months. Issues about the rules, but one of the things that we work with is with the voting, and this is the committee that's in charge of voting, and that's why I've taken the lead on so many of these voting issues, like automatically registering. This is my proposal, and as president I could get it done. Every kid to vote when they turn 18 across the country, not having these patchworks of vote. Now, one of the things that I've led on is making sure that our voting machines work for people with disabilities, and we have pushed the administration, we've pushed for funding. I'm actually the one that actually led the effort to get the voting machine funding that we just got. A lot of it was focused on security, but one of my messages to the Election Assistance Commission was that we make sure that any purchases of election equipment also worked for people with disabilities. Because we cannot make strides toward election security and then go backwards when it comes to people with disabilities voting. So I am in a moment right now in time where I have been pushing this election funding and upgrading our equipment, in part because of accessibility issues, in part because of voter suppression issues, and then of course in part because we have a president that seems to believe that it's okay for a foreign power to make mincemeat of our democracy, which I do not believe. And that is something that is right before us right now, where we have 11 states that don't have backup ballots. We have no proof of what has happened when people vote in those states if someone hacked into them. So we have to do both things at once. We have to make sure our election equipment is secure, and then we also have to make sure that it is accessible for everyone to vote. And we don't just do that, we expand it. We make sure that voting places, right, are accessible for people that are in wheelchairs or in walkers or are unable to use steps. This is something near and dear to my heart, being from Minnesota, a state that we have been such a leader along with Iowa on infrastructure that is accessible, and we must continue that when it comes to voting.
Thank you. I would now like to introduce Dr. Cindy Hanawalt, who is the immediate past president of the Linn County Medical Society, and she will be your moderator from here on out.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Well, I would like to start with a question regarding prescription drug prices. So prescription drug prices in the U.S. have been rising at an alarming rate. 1 in 4 patients report not filling prescriptions for their loved ones or their families due to cost. In 2015, pharmacy costs were 17% of all healthcare expenses. How do you plan to get a handle on the drug costs while maintaining Americans' access to pharmaceutical innovations?
Okay. Well, thanks so much, because this is really the issue of our time, and it is sitting right out there. These pharma lobbyists, just so you know why we got to where we are, why we have these hugely high drug prices, where many cases our drug prices are twice as much for common drugs than they are in places like Canada and actually other countries around the world. Well, in the United States of America right now, we have 2 pharma lobbyists for every member of Congress. Think about it. 2 pharma lobbyists for every member of Congress. They have this huge amount of money. They've been pushing their interests, and they think they own Washington. And honestly, they probably do. But here's the key thing. They don't own me. And I have been the lead. Since I got to Washington, I have been the lead on the bill that would require Medicare to negotiate better prices for our seniors. And that is something that's very important to me. And that would help, of course, people in the disability community as well, who so much, and a much higher percentage, rely on these prescription drugs. And right now, there is literally a ban on Medicare negotiating for 43 million seniors, many of them with disabilities. A ban, whereas the VA and Medicaid are able to negotiate. The other thing I would do, and I've done this bill with Bernie, and then also with Senator McCain, and actually Senator Grassley has now taken it up with me, and that is to allow less expensive drugs to come in from other countries, like Canada, that are safe places. So people don't have to go on buses to get there. We can actually legally allow. Think of the competition that would create. Then the other thing I'd suggest is to look at the House bill that we're pretty excited about that puts a cap on prices based on international. That, by the way, for the government alone brings in $350 billion in taxpayer savings. Imagine what that would do for individual consumers. And we are living at a time where I brought to the State of the Union a woman named Nicole Smith Hope. And her son was a restaurant manager at a suburban restaurant in the Twin Cities. And he had been on his parents' insurance because of the great protections in the Affordable Care Act. And when he turned 26, then he couldn't afford the insulin anymore. And so at a late night speaking, I had the 10:30 time slot. And so he ended up actually trying to ration his insulin, and he died. And I brought her to the State of the Union, so she sat above and looked down at the President of the United States, who, by the way, promised us on Fox News that he would bring drug prices down so low that it would make your head spin. That's what he said. We have a tape of that. So how has it made our head spin? Well, it's because they're going up and up, because he's made no improvement. So I think there's so much opportunity here to bring these drug prices down, to save money for the government, but most importantly, to save money for our disability community.
I'd like to take a moment and talk about workplace violence. According to a 2019 report released by the American Nurses Association, the rate of violence against healthcare workers has reached an epidemic proportion, with healthcare workers as much as 12 times more likely than the general population to suffer injury from violence at work. This finding is even more concerning when it is understood that the violent and abuse incidents are probably significantly underreported, because healthcare providers often feel that that's their job and they're trying to take care of a vulnerable population. The incidents are more of a problem in the emergency rooms, but they occur in all of our healthcare places. Can you comment on your thoughts on workplace violence?
Sure. When we talk about respecting the dignity of work, it is about making sure that people get fair wages, and that's especially important in the healthcare field right now, because I think we don't have enough healthcare workers. We're going to have over 1 million openings in the next 10 years for home healthcare workers. We're going to have a lot of openings in long-term care facilities as well. And so it is important that we have protections in place. Well, the best protection is actually adequate staffing, so that if you don't have one person alone and you have 2 people there. The other protection is making sure that there's security and that people have someone to go to if something goes wrong. And then you just make sure you have facilities that work, so that you're able to screen patients and make sure that if there's someone that maybe through no fault of their own, oftentimes because of whatever condition they have, could be violent, that you're making sure you're monitoring them, that they have adequate medication. It really goes in with everything we're talking about, so that we make sure we have strong health care. That's why I am such a strong proponent of the Affordable Care Act and actually expanding on that. with a public option. But the most important thing for the disability community, I think you know what it is, and that is to make sure we strongly keep in place the protection so no one can be kicked off their insurance for a pre-existing condition. That is the number one thing. Because before that time, we had all kinds of stories of people with disabilities that were unable to get insurance. I still remember being in a small town parade up in northern Minnesota while we were having the debate because Trump was trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And I remember there was this mom pushing a stroller in a little parade. And she said, "This is my son. You can meet him here." And he was like 4. She said, "He has Down syndrome." And she said, "This is what a pre-existing condition looks like." And she said, "I will do anything to protect my boy so he doesn't lose his health care." It's a beautiful story, but it's also a story of leading. It's a story of our party, the Democratic Party, actually making the point really clearly to people, no matter what political party they were, whether they voted before or not, that this pre-existing condition, which isn't exactly a word that comes off the tip of your tongue, right? That it meant something. So that was the first thing she said to me in that parade. So all of this, the potential violence against workers and keeping our hospitals safe and making sure that we have places for people to stay, it really all comes down to our values and putting people first. And that is why we need to have a new president of the United States.
Thank you, Senator, for the time. I'll take this opportunity to let you have a final remark.
I think I'll end. I started with my daughter, and maybe I'll end with her, because the story, as I said, in her case, is she still was sick as she was growing up, but she ended up as, of course, someone that my husband and I love more than anyone in the world. And one of my favorite stories about her was when she was about 4 years old, and she was in the nativity play at work. And she was to be the angel. And she was sitting out there in the pews, and she had this big angel costume on with these wings that were like weighing her down. And it was a rehearsal. And I said, "Why won't you go out there?" She said, "Because I want to be the donkey." And I said, no. These 2 boys, teenage boys with the donkey, Timmy and Joey. I go, "They're the donkey, so you can't be the donkey." "Well, I want to be Mary." I said, "No, Mary is 14 years old. I go, "I don't understand. You have the coolest thing in the whole play. You get to go out and spread your wings. I don't understand. Why won't you go out?" And she looks over and she whispers at me, and she goes, looks way at the top of the church. She goes, "Mom, I don't know how to tell them. I don't know how to fly." And I said to her that day, "You know what, honey? Not all angels fly." And what I want to say to you is that you are the guardian angels by being here today on a Saturday afternoon. You are the guardian angels for people with disabilities. Some of you have disabilities yourselves. Some of you have people with disabilities in your families, or some of you just know someone. And the work that you are doing by representing this community, and by getting every major presidential candidate practically to come here today, you are giving others the wings to fly. So I want to thank you, because you're doing the work for people that may never know you and may never meet you, but it matters. So thank you for being their guardian angels, and thank you for having me here today.